This console generation has been very interesting because I think a lot of people had it in their heads that there was going to be like a pattern repeat because people had created this fan fiction narrative that Nintendo had never, ever, ever released two successful platforms in a row. That the pattern would continue and that the Switch 2 would be a massive decline from the Switch 1. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. But the justification these people used to push this mindset, to push this narrative, is that they looked at the Wii U. They tried to use the Wii U to push this idea that the Switch 2 would fail. And I do think we really do need to take a deep dive into why the Wii U actually underperformed because I feel like people really strongly misrepresent what actually happened in this scenario and how in the long term it was not relevant in the slightest because when you look at everything else Nintendo did. When you look at like all the other consoles Nintendo released, when you look at the Wii, the DS, the 3DS, the Switch, and now the Switch 2, what you see is that every single one of these platforms was extremely successful. Technically, we haven't had a Nintendo console that's underperformed since like the GameCube. And that thing was going up against the DVD player that was the PS2. So, why exactly did the Wii U underperform? What was the real reason behind it? And the real truth was that Sony wasn't going to allow a repeat of the Wii to happen again. Because at the time, the Wii's success was seen as a fluke. You know, the industry gaslit themselves into thinking nobody actually played the Wii, nobody liked it, that it failed, that it underperformed, that people just bought Wii Sports for it and never touched it again. You know, there was this entire cultural zeitgeist around like hating the Wii, hating the DS, hating Nintendo. It was like the most mainstream it had ever been throughout that period. And throughout to the from 2009 onwards, there was this pretty active agenda from gaming journalists to gaslight people into thinking the Wii was failing, it was on the way out, that nobody was into it anymore, that the motion controls were just waggle. You know, I remember when New Super Mario Bros. Wii came out, the first thing they said was that the game was a disappointment. But the second thing they said was that even though the console had reached its all-time peak of relevancy, it was also on the way out. So from 2010 onward, we were all already being bombarded with information about the Wii HD. You know, that Nintendo was going to do the same thing that the Xbox and the PlayStation were going to do. They were going to make their games like their console more powerful. It was going to be like, it was going to bring in all the third parties. And that was like a big issue when it came to the Wii U, was the complete lack of relevancy of third party support on the platform, because the Wii had no third party support at all. Like, developers came out and they made all these excuses as to why they weren't putting anything out and why they weren't developing anything, even though the Wii was obviously the market leader throughout that entire generation. The the reason for this is that the industry wanted to push like more expensive games. They wanted to produce like, you know, $60 productions. They wanted to drive Nintendo out of the industry, and they absolutely did everything in their power to sabotage the Wii. So it created this illusion that the Wii was this console struggling for like to get high quality new releases, when in fact that the games that were coming out on the Wii were far better than the stuff that was coming out on other platforms. You know, you were getting Assassin's Creed while I was playing like Super Mario Galaxy. Okay. The difference in quality between games at that point was insane. But what was equally insane was how the industry at large tried to gaslight you into thinking the third party games were somehow bigger, more successful, more relevant, more competitive, more innovative, and more popular. You know, it felt like every month for a long time we were getting like all these games that were these new like industry defining classics, you know, Dead Space, Mass Effect, you know, BioShock, Portal. Like, we were told over and over and over again that these were the biggest and best games that were coming out. And then maybe once a year you would give props to like one Nintendo game, but that Nintendo game would always be like written off and ignored, and it would be seen as like just kind of a product of like a declining company. Like, there was this mindset that Nintendo would go out of business after the Wii, and the industry did everything it possibly could to promote that idea leading up until the Wii U. So what happened with the Wii U was that Nintendo came out and they were just like, okay. The primary complaint about the Wii was that there were no third-party games on this platform, that nobody wanted to like play any of our games. So what we need to do going forward is that we need to have a greater initiative to get third-party developers on the platform. So the big marketing push for Wii U initially was going to be its third-party support. They gave the floor to a lot of major third-party developers. They approached EA, made a partnership with them. They got Arkham City on Wii U, a new original version for it. We got like all the, games like Zombie U from Ubisoft. Like the big primary push for the Wii U revolved around the third party games and around this idea that the console would be made for older gamers, that Nintendo was listening to consumer feedback and was making something that could evolve the Wii formula. They were making something that kept the design of the original Wii, that kept the motion controls, which kept like the Nintendo first party titles that everyone liked, but it was also getting all of those games that you liked on other platforms. But when the console came out, nobody bought those games because the narrative became that they had already played those games on other platforms, or if they were brand spanking new, the narrative was that they would rather play them on those other platforms. And by the next year, when the PS4 and the Xbox One came out, the narrative became that the Wii U couldn't run the new big third-party games, even though it totally could. So third parties essentially promised Nintendo to support the console. They were given all this time to promote their brands, to like put their best foot forward, to put games on the platform, and they completely failed to deliver. And that left Nintendo with struggling to support the Wii U on their own for a period of about 4 years. Okay. And during that time, they produced some of the best games they've ever done. They did Mario Kart 8, they did Mario 3D World, they did like, Nintendo Land, New Super Mario Bros. U, Star Fox Zero, and finally concluding with The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild on Wii U, March 3rd, 2017. It's very easy to forget that Breath of the Wild launched as a Wii U game. It is very easy to forget that like Breath of the Wild is technically a Wii U game developed entirely for the console, and that the Switch version was a port because the port was so much more successful. But that was the reality behind the Wii U, behind its legacy, is that it had all these bangers. It had one of the best runs of any console developer in history, but the entire industry just kind of sneered at it. The entire industry was doing everything it possibly could to bury this console before it came out. And their very best efforts, their efforts to destroy Nintendo, it resulted in 1 year when they were in the red slightly. That's it. Like, they didn't succeed at all in really even losing Nintendo money. It's true they weren't making money in 2013, the year of Luigi, but they very quickly turned that around with the success of like, all their games that they were putting out in the next several years. And by the time the Switch came out, like, they had recovered completely and were like doing better than ever. But what exactly happened during the Wii U? Why exactly did it not do very well? And the simple fact of the matter is, it had nothing to do with Nintendo itself, but it was because of market conditions. It was because of the culture. It was because of the industry. It was because of third parties doing everything they possibly could to sabotage it in order to benefit their masters at PlayStation and Microsoft. Okay, this was an industry-wide conspiracy that led to the rise of the Nintendo Switch. And this is the thing about the Wii U that's really interesting that I don't see a lot of people talking about, is that rather than Nintendo releasing a flop in between every success story, what we've seen instead is that it seems like the Wii U was sandwiched between two major success stories, the Wii and the Switch. You don't really see a lot of people address the fact that the Wii U was only a thing for about 4 years. It wasn't on the market very long. It did fairly well for itself while it was. It got a lot of bangers, way more than the Virtual Boy. So you can't even say it was the worst Nintendo platform ever made. Like, the Wii U was the best console available for purchase in that time period. And a lot of the games that came out on it, were re-released on Switch and became hyper successful. Some of the best-selling games ever in a lot of cases, like the Wii U, and its sales of performance was an anomaly. And this is the reality that people just don't want to address, is that they want to pretend that the Wii U is the standard state of Nintendo. Like they want to pretend that they're always on the verge of bankruptcy and that they're always failing and they're always on the verge of like releasing another Wii U. Like just look at how many times we've seen people argue that the Switch 2 is going to be another Wii U, even though it outsold the Wii U within like less than a year. Okay. Like, see how many times that has come up when in actuality, when you actually look at the numbers and you look at the market and you look at what's happening, like what happened with the Wii U is simply not possible anymore. Like, Nintendo is never again going to allow third parties to dictate the specs of their console and pressure them into doing things that they're not really comfortable with doing. Because one of the reasons for the Wii U gamepad was because so many people were like demanding a traditional control scheme for their games. The purpose of the gamepad was to incorporate a Nintendo original gimmick, a feature into like a traditional control scheme. And that is now like the industry standard like Nintendo controller today. It's still used on the Switch. We still see like, a lot of those innovations and designs used in the Switch today. But at the time, nobody cared. Okay. When the third parties were expected to step up and deliver their games, day and day on Wii U throughout 2013, they refused to do it. They cited the sales numbers and their performance, but the simple fact was that they never really showed up to begin with. They never really had any intention of supporting the console at all. And considering just how we still have not seen a Call of Duty game on Nintendo Switch or Switch 2 in the past decade, it really demonstrates how desperate that industry is to keep their biggest and best titles off the platform, to drive sales for the consoles that will actually cater to their desires, to push microtransactions, to exploit the consumer, to force advertisements into games. And what was the end result of these decisions? What happened after the Wii U? Nintendo exploded in relevancy. They became extremely popular and extremely successful, while the very same people who ignored the Wii U and tried to downplay it are indeed on the verge of bankruptcy. It is not a coincidence that Ubisoft, one of the most notable examples of a company that tried to pretend they were giving the Wii U support only to back out at a critical juncture. Like, they're done. They're finished. They're never going to recover from their current position. And they're far from the only example of that. Square, Capcom, Konami, like the list goes on and on and on. Like every other developer in the industry, the ones that refuse to support the Wii U and refuse to support Nintendo are on the verge of bankruptcy now. Meanwhile, Nintendo is the only relevant company in gaming. The Wii U was not a failure. Like, it's not really possible for Nintendo to fail because of how they have their ecosystem set up and how strict their budgets are, and because of like how they're not chasing like the quick buck and are like playing the long game. Like people don't realize just how amazing of a job they did handling the Wii U situation for what it was. Because it's true the console did not sell, but they kept supporting it. They kept putting new games on it. They actually garnered a huge dedicated fan base on the platform. And when they released a lot of these games on Switch, a lot of them did phenomenally well and became classics in their own right, even if they were like downright downplayed and ignored initially. Like, again, there are like a lot of examples of this, but the simple fact of the matter is, like, it's not talked about enough about what the pivot actually means. The fact that Nintendo was able to put out like the Switch after the Wii U, it doesn't mean that the Switch is like some freak success story that like shouldn't have been possible. It means that Nintendo was always a successful, well-run brand that had a dedicated audience that was recovering after a minor setback. That's it. Like the Wii U was an anomaly. But the mindset of the community at large is that it was not an anomaly. It was the standard state of Nintendo. The idea that Nintendo was constantly failing. This idea that they had ingrained in them since the Sega Genesis days, with like Genesis does. Like you still hear people obsess over ads like that because of just how much of a hold they had on the audience at the time. And it really says a lot, I think, about like gaming as a whole, where it's not really about celebrating gaming or celebrating the accomplishments or like celebrating the games you enjoy. Like a good chunk of it is like complaining endlessly about Nintendo, especially if you're not actually a Nintendo fan. I think it's very telling just how the people who complain the most about the Wii U are people who aren't fans or weren't there or don't know anything about it. Like for them, this is just something they can use to weaponize against Nintendo with no real regard for the context or really understanding like what actually happened. Like the simple fact of the matter is that Nintendo Wii U was a huge success because this console, its form, its design, it's what directly led to the success of the Switch. And that absolutely needs to be acknowledged and respected.